right, well, we are back. Okay, what we're going to be doing now is taking the first task that has been accomplished, which is the centering, and we're now going to talk about opening and also the building of the wall and the actual removal of a piece, finished object. So I'm going to go through those things right now. I have washed my hands, so I need to get my hands slicked down again, get the wheel turning yet again. The first task that we're going to look into is the act of opening, and that is the act of moving down inside this mass of clay as it's rotating and expanding it out, defining a floor for our piece. We're going to make a simple, just kind of cylindrical shape here. Defining a floor, and then the building of the wall or the pulling of the wall is that next step. For now though, just opening. So I want you to think of a compass. And by compass, I don't mean the navigational tool to help you find which way is north. I mean a compass, one of these, that has a pencil on one side and the point on the other that helps you draw perfect circles. So I want you to think of a compass. This would be the center point here in the very center of the clay, and then the outside point would be on the outer wall of the mass of clay here. So what I want you to think of here is that if you have a fixed hand, so if you have a hand that's touching the outside edge of the clay, if I turn this way you can kind of see this a little bit better. Do it this way. So if I have a hand here on the outside surface of the clay and it's centered, you can see my hand is still. It's going to remain still always. If I can connect another hand to that hand, so I'm going to move this thumb over, I'm just going to connect with it, I can then feel free, wherever I like, to drop a line, basically. I think you can see me doing that there. And that's basically how a compass works, right? So I here have produced a compass from my two hands, basically. Here's the fixed point. Again, I'm going to touch anywhere I want. I can scribe a perfect circle on this mass of clay. So that's the theory of opening on center. Now, how I want to do this, though, of course, is I want that opening to happen in the center of the mass of clay. I want to drill down a certain distance. So I want to go down probably about this far. I want to leave enough clay in the floor of the piece against the wheel head so that when I remove it from the wheel, it actually still has a bottom enough to pick up and maintain its shape and things like that. So let's see what this would look like for real as we do it here. Let me center this up just a little bit taller. So I'm going to draw this up just a little bit. Go ahead and I'm going to flatten the top here so you can see very clearly what I'm up to. Okay, so if I have a hand on the outside surface of the clay, I'm going to connect to that here with this other hand, and I'm going to start to push down in. I like to use at least 2 fingers to start to drill down and inward into the center. I'm just going to push down a little bit there to start with. You can see that is the depth there. I've just gone down about maybe a little less than an inch. A lot of hand gestures in throwing, people will say things like, oh, put your hands like this. No, put them like this. No, wait, do that, do this, do that, right? You're going to hear a lot of that from people, from your peers, maybe even from myself a little bit. What's important is what feels comfortable to you. So if you can get a hand anywhere on the outside of this form, it might be the left hand drilling down, it might be the right, whatever feels comfortable, whatever kind of your instincts tell you about where you want to be is what's going to work best for you. There is no one way to do it. I've seen it done hundreds and hundreds of ways. After we have that little well, though, in the top, we should have a little depression. I'm going to put a little bit of water in there. I'm going to get back to that job. So always when I'm opening, I want to have a hand on the outside of the mass of clay. That way, when I drill downward, that cavity on the interior is on center compared to the outer diameter. So we want to see those things referenced to each other. I'll have another video, I think, from an aerial view, so you can see how this is done from an aerial view, and that might help you to see that as well. All right, so here's that hand on the outside. I'm going to brace against that. That thumb jutting up allows me to do that. and then I can just put a nice firm downward pressure down into the piece. If you feel any friction or it dragging your hand or it corkscrewing at all, just slowly remove your hands and just give it a little bit more water. Okay, so I've gone down to about this depth now, right? So I'm about that deep. At this point, I want to widen and open the piece just a little bit so I can have a better view of the floor and then actually work on that a little. So this can happen a number of ways. What I'm going to do this time is I'm going to brace on the outside with my other hand. I'm going to reach in and I'm going to hook along that wall and I'm just going to pull that open. I'm just going to pull back towards myself, nice and slow and steady, and open up the shape so I have just a little bit more access into the interior. You can see now that I have a big opening. Down in the bottom there, what I have is there's a bunch of muck, a bunch of slop. The floor of the piece is kind of going like this, up and down. So what I want to go through right now is the actual compressing of the floor process. This is an important step to making anything on the wheel. This is a really important one. Compressing the floor is much like compressing a slab, and you remember doing that from a previous project. I'm going to use water and a downward pressure. I'm going to move back and forth over the floor. I think you can see probably can't see much, but basically my fingers are working from the center point out to the outer edge and back. I'm going to go back and forth over the floor with a nice downward pressure, making it a little bit smoother, making it a little bit flatter also. But most importantly, I'm making the clay a little bit more dense down there. It's not as open and light and fluffy, it's a little more dense and rigid. And this is really important. As a cylinder dries, as any kind of pottery form dries, it puts a lot of tension on the floor, which is ultimately kind of a cap on that outer wall shape that is shrinking and compressing and moving inward. A lot of tension on the floor. If the floor is not nice and dense, the floor will crack as a way to relieve that tension. We want it to be able to stand up to that tension all the way through the drying shrinkage and the firing shrinkage. So again, that back and forth really helps with that. I always will follow that up with a rib. So here, I'm just going to move to the interior. I'll slow my wheel down quite a bit too, but I'm going to move to the interior and just give that a nice downward pressure. And same thing, I'm going to move back and forth over the surface of the floor from the center to the outer edge and back again. And we've probably been spending a good 30 seconds to a minute on this process. I won't say exactly how long you should do it. 30 seconds seems like a long time when you're just doing one thing as the wheel's turning there. Spend a full minute if you think it's gonna, if you think that's more prudent. The more time you spend down there is the more insurance that your piece will not crack during the drying. Okay, so we have an opened, compressed floor, centered piece of clay. And my goal now is to start to pull and build the wall. We're going to make a cylinder probably about this high. It's not going to be anything particularly interesting, but it would be the foundation to making all other forms. So a couple quick things that you can do when the clay is open. We can still squeeze it in this fashion and draw the walls a little bit more inward, especially while it's nice and thick like it is now. So I'm going to go ahead and just squeeze that inward. If I want to move up cylindrically, I know that centrifugal force likes to open forms up. So I want to move right up straight vertically, which means I'm going to start, this is kind of like predictive, right? I'm going to start with a form that's moving inward slightly like that. So I like that shape a little bit better to start with. So let me get the walls slicked down. And now let me kind of talk about pulling up or building the wall. What we're ultimately going to be doing, let me give a hand gesture here, is we're going to be connecting our hands together at the thumbs maybe, or at the heel of the hand, whatever is most comfortable to you. And ultimately, I want to find a way that I can get my fingers to meet on either side of this wall and still be able to sense where they are in relationship to each other. What I don't want is for the fingers to be out of skew like this, out of skew like this, or out of skew, I don't know if you can see this, but kind of front to back. Ultimately, I want them to meet right on either side of the wall. Together with some water and some slurry, which is another term for wet clay. That should slip along the wall. I should be able to squeeze the wall as the wheel turns and move the wall upward. If I squeeze the clay, remember back in centering, it's going to make the clay rise. So if I squeeze here just on the wall, that should rise up. Quick by the way, all work now that the piece is open should be done roughly at 3 o'clock. So if this is a clock face here, right at 3 o'clock would be where the right hand is on the outside edge here, and the left hand will be on the inside. So if I can connect my thumbs or the heels of my hands or whatever, I can generally have a much easier time of having those fingers meet up on either side of the wall to do the pulling process. If they are independent, my two hands, of one another, that's a lot more difficult. One hand starts to surf around, maybe one hand gets ahead of the other one, and that's where most twist, torque, and problems happen during the pulling of the wall. So I want to avoid that. All right. So I like to hold a sponge in my outside hand. I'll usually just put it kind of back here. It's actually my fingertips that are on the clay, but that sponge is located right back there, and I can squeeze it a little bit if I need to, delivering a little water right to the wall. I won't have that on my inside hand. That's just too much for me to think about. So often I'll use the sponge up here just to deliver water to the inside wall. Okay, so let's get started. I'm going to go right down here, right down at the wheel head. You can see me squeezing inward. And then I'm going to start to slowly, very, very slowly, I'm going to start rising upward. I can see on the video I have a terrible shadow. Forgive me for that. Work on my lighting for next time. So I'm going to pull right on up and then stop before I get to the top of the rim there. So you can see we've developed the height just a little bit. We have a little bit of clay down here that you can see over on this side. It moves down and then kind of skirts out onto the wheel head. I'm just going to reach in with a finger and get rid of a little bit of that. That'll help me on my next pull to get right in under there and pull that clay up into the piece. Now stop short of my rim just a little bit. This is an important step I'd like you to be in the habit of. Right now I'm going to compress the rim. So we've compressed slabs, we've compressed the floor of this piece. We're also going to compress the rim, and that's going to happen often. What I'm going to do that is I'm going to sort of squeeze and pinch the rim. I can kind of change its shape a little bit as I'm touching it here. But I'm also, this is my tool that I'm going to use. I'm going to squeeze here, and then I'm going to bring this finger downward. And you can see I can basically crowd the rim from all sides. We're making it a little more dense. We might be thickening it just a little bit, but most importantly, we're rendering the top of the vessel level. Not moving up and down, not off kilter one way or the other, but nice and level. And if you can do that after each and every pull, you'll always see a little bit of oddness happening at the top of the vessel after each pull. But if you can compress the rim and level that off, then each time you build it, you still have something that's in control. So let's do another wall pull. Move in here. And I'll tell you, this is interesting to do when you're not watching the piece, but you're watching on camera. Reaching in. Most of the pressure is on my outside hand right now. The inside hand is there, certainly, on the opposing side of the wall, but it's not pressing very hard. It's more just simply there as a guide. My outside hand is the one that's really pushing pretty hard there. And you'll see I'll always stop just short of the rim. I've done this for a little while, and I've learned that I like to have a little clay up in the rim. I like to have a little bit extra thickness there. I find that it helps me to, helps me just to keep things in check and helps it from being too floppy. Just secure that again there. Okay, so another thing that you can do that can be really helpful, if you're getting a little bit of twist in the piece maybe, or just as another way to think about building the wall. We've been pulling the wall upward a couple of times. I'm going to start at the top and pull the wall downward. What this often does, if you remember in the centering video, we talked about those spirals going in opposite directions, canceling each other out. Here that's happening as well. And although the spirals in this case are much closer together, much tighter together, this does actually make for a smoother, tighter, more dense surface. Helps me be in a little bit better control overall. And does develop the height just a little bit, just a little bit. Okay, so I'm just pulling a little bit of water out of the interior. So we have a cylindrical form now. We have a thing. It has a floor, it has a sidewall, it has a rim, and from here it would be just your ultimate goal is like, well, what do I do with this? What do I make from it? So that part will be up to you. I encourage you to play and discover and find all the different things that are possibilities here. In this case, I'm just going to use a rib. I'm just going to give this a little more volume and maybe a texture, and then we'll call this task video accomplished. So this is something, I'm going to just tuck this in. This is kind of not something I always do, but this is something that you can do. So the wooden knife here can be a really wonderful tool. I'm going to reach right down to the bottom here. I'm going to brace that tool with both hands, and just as it slides along the side of the form, I'm going to let it cut in right down at the bottom there, and kind of trim and tailor the bottom edge of the vessel to be a little bit more tidy. Now I can move in. Now I can get the rib right down against the form, right very much down to the wheel head. And I can start to give this just a little bit more volume as I throw more so into the rib. So naturally, it's always helpful to know what you're making before you make it. Know where you want things to go. Ribs can of course be used to make a form feel more architectural, a little bit more controlled. I like to work with these quite a bit. So let's give this a little more volume still. When you're working into the ribs, you really can push a little harder from the inside into that surface of the rib and give pieces a little bit more volume or even constrict them. And that's all dependent upon where you want to go in the actual shape. So I'll just work bottom to top, then back top to bottom. Series of times, expanding the volume each time just a little bit, much in the way that you would inflate a balloon. And I'm trying to be kind of sensitive to the thickness of the wall, so as I'm doing this, I'm trying to, through touch, understand how thin is that wall getting. And with my limited knowledge of clay, I'm trying to figure out, well, how far can I go before that becomes too thin and the piece begins to collapse. And I think some of the most exciting vessel forms on the wheel are those that push the throwing just up to that point of collapse, but they don't allow the piece to go into that state of collapse. So for this particular one, I think I'll stop there. And again, you can use the ribs to shape, tool, provide a more kind of architectural sense to the things that you're making. And also to provide texture, right? So I often like to use the corner of the rib, maybe to band a piece. Maybe we'll just stick with something very, very simple like that for this one. let's remove this piece from the wheel. So the last thing that I'll do is just to use the wooden knife down around the bottom of the piece here. I'm going to create a little notch just by cutting in underneath the piece ever so slightly. Pick up my wire tool. I'm going to wrap that up between my fingers so that I'm able to really hold it down tight against the wheel head as I pull under the piece. Pull that right in, under, and through. The piece is now separated from the wheel. We should have enough clay down here, down at the bottom of the piece, to be able to reach in, just pinch, and pick that up. And then I'll just set that aside on a board.